In many ways, John Dewey was the stereotypical or prototypical American philosopher. Much like pragmatism itself, which is not only a distinctively American philosophy, but as Bertrand Russell has argued, a stereotypically American philosophy. And that's because, like pragmatism, Dewey is intensely democratic, practical, progressive, optimistic. He was an individual, and it's a philosophy which is always bursting with activity and new projects of reform. And it represents much of what is best in the American character, in particular, in the case of Dewey, what's best in the New England variant of the American character, what used to be called New England liberalism. In addition to his philosophic writings, Dewey is famous for, among other things, the Dewey Decimal System and writings on various social and pedagogical issues, many of which had profound impact, particularly the pedagogical ones. He championed and instituted a lot of the reforms in higher education, particularly the seminar form, which was previously associated with German universities. However, philosophically, he's most famous for his defense of pragmatism and his instrumentalist version of pragmatism, which is, as I've mentioned, the distinctively American philosophy. Now, pragmatism had been created, in fact, by an American logician in the 19th century by the name of Charles Saunders Peirce. And it had primarily been a philosophical movement based on a theory of meaning. The theory of meaning says something like this, that a sentence, the meaning of a sentence or a statement is based on what philosophers sometimes call its logical consequences. What that means is, if we have a sentence we want to understand, we ask ourselves, if this sentence were true, what would be the practical results for experience? What would we expect to experience if this sentence were true as opposed to some other sentence? And when we get a sense of what the practical significance for our experience of the truth of a particular sentence would be, we have a sense of what that sentence means. Now, in philosophy, this became a method because it's a method for settling arid metaphysical disputes. We have two philosophers. One says that being is unity, is one. Reality is unified. It is one big whole. Another is a pluralist. There's no reality is many. The pragmatist says, okay, what practically would I experience differently if being was one or if being was many? Would the coffee taste differently? Would science work differently? Would the cosmos work differently? And if they don't work differently, if there's no practical consequence from one belief or the other, then they mean the same thing. Or better yet, they mean nothing at all. And so, in fact, it's a very radical methodology for literally dissolving philosophical problems and pushing them towards either practical solutions or complete dissolutions entirely. Now, with this method and theory of meaning was associated a conception of truth. Sentences are true when they successfully predict our experience. In other words, if the meaning of a sentence is what potentially it implies for our experience, when that implication comes true in our experience, then that sentence is right for us. Since such predictions afford control over the world, theories are true, collections of sentences, when they are predictive and in this sense help when they work, when they help us master our environment, right? Prediction allows us control over nature. So a theory is true when, pragmatically speaking, it works. When it works better than its competitors, when there's more things we can do with it to help us get some handle on working through our environment. Now, Peirce had laid down this sort of central elements of the doctrine. William James, the doctor, biologist, psychologist, had popularized the doctrines of Peirce and added a theistic and morally progressive element to them. In fact, I think it's important to realize in the early 20th century, pragmatism is associated with a political reform movement known as progressivism, which is basically the ancestor to modern liberal social democracy. And while Dewey added his instrumental pragmatism, added some new nomenclature, particularly the phrase naturalistic empiricism that we'll talk about, to this theory, his real contribution to pragmatism lies elsewhere, not in the development of the theory, but rather in giving it a historical and what I would call historicistic dimension. What I mean by that is Dewey is the first to try to place pragmatism within the large context of the traditional genre of philosophy, to see where it fits there, what its role within that tradition is. Now, there are a couple reasons for this, that Dewey would do this. First of all, he's the first pragmatist who's really a trained philosopher schooled in the traditional literature. And that gives him, I would argue, the perspective to judge just what the significance of this new movement is. But secondly, and in many ways more importantly, before being a pragmatist, Dewey was a Hegelian. As such, there's a strong residue of Hegelian historicism in Dewey's thought. He always tends to look at things in their historical context, to be sensitive to the relativity very often of judgments in a cultural context. Now, Dewey's historical defense of pragmatic philosophy was in many ways a very difficult project because in some sense, at least, pragmatism is not really a philosophy at all. Consider, it rejects the classical pursuit of eternal truth. It offers no eternal truths. It offers no epistemological certainty. What works today may not work tomorrow. What works today may be superseded by something that works better tomorrow. It offers no necessary metaphysical doctrines, right? In offering a method, it offers no conclusions. And even that conception of truth is far from a theory of truth. To say that the true is what works is simply to say it's good to believe true things. Well, that's a nice compliment to say about truth, but it's hardly what the traditional philosophy would consider a theory of truth in any serious sense. So in that traditional sense of philosophy, it's not really a philosophy at all. In fact, it's really an anti-philosophy. It's really a critique and negation of philosophy. As I mentioned, it's a way of dissolving, of eliminating philosophy, of suggesting that it's been a mistake and we should try to do something else for a change. So what Dewey does in his historicizing project is try to show us how he came to practice traditional philosophy, rather than what other historians of philosophy would do, which is to offer the reasons on behalf of a particular system. Dewey never offers the reasons on behalf of a system. Instead, he says, look, there are historical reasons why this system took the form it did. Let me give you those, and then we can look at its results and criticize it on that basis. Now, this is not a unique methodology. Other Hegelians do it. Most notably, this is what Marxist critique is. Right? Marx says, I don't want to explain the reasons for Ricardo's classical economy. I want to show you the sociological reasons why he believes what he does. And once I've done that, I've demysticized what may seem to be the necessity of Ricardo's solutions. And Nietzsche did the same thing with Christian morality. Instead of arguing for it or against it, he said, look, let me explain to you historically how this thing came to be. And you'll see that it's not necessary, and it's possible to conceive of the world without it. So much of Dewey's work, both in Reconstruction and philosophy and in Experience in Nature, takes the form of a historico-sociological criticism of previous philosophies, as in, as I've mentioned, Nietzsche and Marx. Now, at the center of Dewey's historical criticism is an interpretation of the origins of philosophy on the one hand, and a critique of the traditional philosophy and its fixation with what he considers the central element, a spectatorial or contemplative theory or view of knowledge. Now, for Dewey, the basic stuff of philosophy isn't science. It doesn't arise from reason. Rather, the basic stuff, the Urstuff from which it will later develop, historically speaking, is desire and imagination as they take form in things like poetry, drama, and myth. Over time, and specifically we're thinking of Greece, which is where philosophy was historically born, over time these things become ritualized and consolidated in things like religious doctrine, social ritual, and even for that matter, religious ritual. Philosophy emerges when, at a certain point, breakthroughs in natural science, as we've seen in the pre-Socratics, and in mathematics, as we've seen with Pythagoras and Euclid, come into conflict with those traditional beliefs and customs. A tension emerges. The worldview of the Olympian pantheon, of the Homeric hero, starts to come in conflict with a changed environment, due not only, as I've mentioned, to these breakthroughs in natural science and mathematics, but also in a changed political environment. The overthrow of the Persians, the emergence of the Greek city-state. So what philosophy tries to do is secure a new foundation for our traditional moral beliefs, a rational foundation for them, which is necessary since the traditional foundation has been undermined by these changes. It also, however, tries to adjust those values, customs, and mores to this changed environment so that those mores will be more effective and that the form of life will be more successful. Now, this was the basic project of both the sophists on the one hand and Plato and Aristotle on the other. And it remains, for Dewey at least, the primary charge of philosophy in the best, and by this we mean the non-traditional sense, the love of wisdom. Its basic charge is to show how things hang together and how they ought to hang together in the broadest sense, how our drama and literature hangs together with our science and our logic and our moral conceptions. Okay, I want now to turn to the major problem Dewey finds in the historical tradition, which is the spectatorial view of knowledge. Now, the spectator view interprets knowledge as a relation between, on the one hand, a passive knowing subject, and on the other, an inert world of objects, external objects. Knowledge occurs then when the knowing subject correctly identifies the properties, classifications, and forms, essences of objects and beings that are external to him in his thought or her thought. Right. This conception obviously originated with Plato and Aristotle. Now, Dewey wants to suggest that this is not the only way to think about knowledge, that it seems natural to us because it's what we're used to, but it originated in Plato and Aristotle not for logical reasons, but for historical and sociological reasons. Greek society, Dewey divides into two very broad classes. On the one hand, there were idle aristocrats who lived a life of aesthetic contemplation. Now, what distinguished the aristocrat was he never worked with his hands. He never got involved in the grubby world of material phenomena and changes. He lived a life of enjoying beautiful works of art, of enjoying various leisure activities. On the other hand, with the vast bulk of people living in a place like Athens who were either slaves or artisans or farmers or laborers. And these were people who, in fact, whose activities were purely practical. Okay. Plato and Aristotle obviously didn't come from that second group of people, came from the former group. Plato was a scion of a very wealthy aristocratic family. As a result, they naturally came to see knowledge as akin to aesthetic apprehension, literally as contemplation. Knowledge is a relation between subject and object, much as looking at a piece of art is a relation between a passive subject looking at an inert object. That's why they are so obsessed with unchanging form. Right? Both of their philosophies seek the eternal, the immutable in reality, at the expense of the temporary and malleable, which they argue you can't really know. There's nothing you can really understand about that. All you can really understand is essence and form, the timeless and eternal. We should remember, sociologically speaking, that the world of the temporal and malleable, the lower realm, as Plato would put it, is precisely the world of craftsmen, of artisans, of people whose lives are practical. So the realm of the craftsman was thus secondary, not only in an epistemological sense, in that you really couldn't know anything about it, so craftsmen really don't know anything, as it turns out, or anything worth knowing. But more importantly, it's also metaphysically secondary. They live in a grubby world, a world of purposes and change, as opposed to a world of eternal forms and truths, which is superior and more real, of course, than the physical world in which we live, the world of grubby mechanics. And it's a world in which we can step in whenever we engage in philosophic contemplation. We can leave the grubby world of shopkeepers and workers. Now, this interpretation of the knowledge situation, subject and object, was inherited by the medievals and scholastics from the classical tradition, and it remained at the core of theological thinking. After that, it was given new form and a new life in the modern epoch by Descartes, whose entire conception and search for epistemic certainty comes from a spectatorial view. We are a mind looking at an external, inert world of matter. And we have to, our truth comes when our ideas in our mind correspond to that external world. And this forms the core of modern traditional philosophy and has given rise to several rather unfortunate distinctions and quandaries. I want to run through some of them for you. The first is that the distinction between a knowing subject and a known object gives rise to the larger distinction between subject and object as metaphysical categories. This becomes very important in German philosophy in the 19th century. It turns out the fundamental structure of the universe is subject-object. This is out there objectively. And this gives us a bifurcated world between, on the one hand, the material world of objects, and on the other, a supersensible, supernatural world of subjects. Subjects which don't exist in space and time, which transcend space and time, which aren't physical, which have no mass, no volume. That's left for that lower world of objects. Now, this distinction between, obviously, the metaphysical realm of subject and object is always an invidious distinction. The purpose of it is to draw us away from the world of objects, because that's lower, it's baser. Again, there's that aristocratic element there. It tries to draw us up into the richer, higher, ethereal realm of subject, true being. Now, the next distinction is that between theory and practice, and this is perhaps even more troubling. Since true knowledge is purely contemplative, right? It's that active apprehension, as opposed to grubby practical knowledge, there emerges a distinction between, on the one hand, theory, which gives us truth, and practice, which only gets results. Theory is thus concerned with capital T truth. And as a result, it is given carte blanche to have no implication for practical results. So true theories may not have anything to do with the world around us. In fact, presumably they will have nothing to do with the world around them, and they have every right to ignore practice. And as we'll see, subsequently, this has profound moral implications for the practice of philosophy. But by contemplating the nature of pure being in itself, being with a capital B, being timeless and eternal, theory builds, in fact, an imaginary world, a world which is immune from the other world, the world in which we live. It's immune from change. It's immune from transformation. It's immune from all of the, quote, defects and maladies of practical life. It is, in fact, an aesthetic, aristocratic refuge from the life of the common man. It's a way of leaving the world of troubles in which we live and entering a dream world. Philosophy thus comes, in the words of the layman, to be painfully abstract from everyday life and irrelevant to human concerns. As Marx said, and I think there's a strong correlation between Dewey and Marx on the question of theory and practice. And I quote Marx on his thesis on Feuerbach, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." Right? The point of philosophical breakthrough is to make the world better, not just to amuse us with sort of interesting riddles. Now, the contemplative vision of knowledge also gives rise to another distinction, especially in post-Cartesian philosophy, between mind and matter, which is emblematic of a whole host of other metaphysical dualisms. Now, the first thing to note is none of these are fruitful in any practical sense. I mean, the distinction between mind and matter is not an important element in the development of psychology. It's not important in the development of physics. It's a purely philosophic, in the worst sense, doctrine. And one of the other and perhaps more damning results of these sorts of dualisms is that they all attempt to derive eternal verities, absolute truths, moral as well as metaphysical, which necessarily bear no relation to the human situation, or what we would call practical life. What all of these dualisms of mind and matter serve to do, or ideal and material, is bootstrap us out of nature. Tell us that we're not really part of this physical world, part of a higher realm where there is no uncertainty, there is no change, there is no becoming, there's just pure, fixed, eternal, capital B, being. Now, such metaphysical doctrines, and we've gone through them in this course, can be, on the one hand, they're always interesting, but they can be either, from our perspective in the 20th century, either laughable, and I give you as an example, Descartes' solipsistic ghost in the machine. If someone were to come up to you today and say, well, you know, I've been thinking seriously, and I've decided that I'm really just an unextended spirit or ghost trapped in a material sort of soft machine, and I've really come to doubt whether there's anything else in the universe. I'm not even sure you're there anymore. You wouldn't say, well, that's a really deep metaphysical insight. What you would probably say is, you've been working a little hard, Jerry. I mean, why don't you go see a doctor, see about some medication? So that's laughable. But it can be even worse than that. They can be absolutely morally repugnant. So you have Leibniz in the late 17th century metaphysically proving that this is in fact the best of all possible worlds. And this is repugnant because Leibniz is a late 17th century German. Germany has been decimated for roughly a century by some of the most horrific religious wars known to man. I mean, the Palatine became soaked in blood. The reason there are so many Germans in Pennsylvania was they were fleeing for their lives from this incredible period of incredible carnage and destruction. I mean, havoc. It would look like the apocalypse had come to Western Germany. And here's Leibniz living there saying, well, this is really the best of all possible worlds. That's not even laughable. Something despicable about philosophy that does that. Or, and I'll give you another example, Hegel. Hegel, whose doctrine is that the rational is the real, and the state is the highest form of moral historical community. That would seem like a laughable doctrine, except that Hegel is saying that on behalf of a Prussian militaristic government. He's being paid to say that to stop student revolts that are trying to bring crazy ideas like, say, democracy or republican government to Germany. So, in fact, this traditional metaphysical dualism and practice of traditional philosophy has had some rather troubling implications for practical life. And this is because the fundamental result of the traditional philosophy has been to divorce inquiry from actual historical conditions and needs. It has thus moved away from, if you remember, its original project in Greece, which was to show how things hang together, to reform customs and mores in light of changed circumstances. But traditional philosophy does just the opposite. It tells us, no, we have to stand on fixed verities, fixed moral principles, eternal moral truths. And the problem is these moral truths were built for a different era. To give an example that was very important for Dewey, who lived through the First World War, Hegel and a whole host of other 19th century thinkers, especially German thinkers, taught us that the nation-state was the ultimate form of historical community, and that its demands exhausted our highest moral duties. So, when the First World War came about, we all supported our nation-states, 100%. And our states became more powerful and fought the war with every resource they could possibly mobilize. And the results were disastrous. Millions upon millions of people were killed. Nothing was achieved. There was no victory. There was no loss. It was just a huge bloodbath. Dewey's point is that the Hegelian moral conception of the state no longer makes sense in a world with mustard gas, machine gun nests, tanks, and aerial bombing. Right? You need different values for a changed environment. Science, unshackled from the straitjacket of philosophy in the 17th century, has fundamentally changed the world in which we live. But traditional philosophy, concerned with being with a capital B and eternal truths, has been unable and unwilling to adapt itself and our moral conceptions to this changed world. Okay. Now, Dewey's historical deconstruction, and by the way, I want to pause here for a minute and point something out. What Dewey has done here, what I've presented to you, is historical deconstruction. And it is exactly the same sort of thing that French philosophers are now famous for having, quote, originated. And this is a deep point Rorty makes about Dewey. The French and many continental thinkers are famous for proclaiming regularly that they've just invented the wheel for the first time. All of that project was done by Dewey long ago. And but the difference is Dewey's historical deconstruction is actually a preparatory phase to reconstruction in philosophy, to building a post-traditional philosophy. Now, while pragmatism as a method offers no particular doctrines, in fact, there are a host of different views one could have and be a pragmatist, Dewey does sketch for us an overall view of his beliefs, which he describes as alternately naturalistic empiricism or empiricistic naturalism. Now, its empiricism lies in the fact that it always begins and ends in experience. All inquiry starts with our experience, and its point is to terminate in our experience and to change it, to enrich it, to make it better. It's naturalistic because it treats the world as natural, as physical, not because of some metaphysical scruple, not because it's a convinced hard-shell materialism, but because that's the current state of our most advanced knowledge. right? Our physics and our biology and our chemistry tell us that the world is natural. If in 5 years it tells us that it's not, then we'll believe something else. So it's not a metaphysical scruple at all. It's a common sense view. What is it that our most advanced knowledge tells us the world is like? Whatever that is, that's our view. It's not metaphysical. In that sense, it's scientistic naturalism. Now, this naturalistic empiricism of Dewey's has profound implications that I want to examine in both the traditional concerns of epistemology and then moral and political philosophy. Now, in epistemology, Dewey wants to replace that epistemic situation of subject and object that I talked about with a naturalistic relationship between organism and environment. It's not subject-object, organism and environment. As an organism becomes increasingly complex, has more organs, more functions, its relations with its environment become a lot more precarious and uncertain. And that's because as it becomes more complex, there open up more possibilities for action, a wider range of possible interactions with its environment. And it becomes harder to know which is the most fruitful course of interaction. It's exactly that situation of doubt which gives rise, Dewey thinks biologically, to thought. Thought is a biological function which serves to help us resolve problems in our interaction with our environment. It's a sort of stimulus and response mechanism. Doubt as to what to do next creates a problem. What should we do next? And thought arises to resolve that problem, to help us figure out in a particular situation. Our thought emerges to help us solve that particular situation. Such thought becomes, in Dewey's sense, intellectual only when it actually changes the environment to make it more secure and less precarious. We are, in a traditional primitive society, we are concerned about the coming rains. We think about the problem. That thought becomes intellectual when we come up with some scheme for shelter. We change our environment so that those rains will not drench us. Now, I should point out that Dewey conceives this natural environment as including cultural as well as physical problems. In other words, he's completely rejecting the dualisms of mind and matter and culture and nature. He's in fact arguing that culture is part of nature. We are natural animals. We are organisms after all. And our culture is part of the world of nature. It's a very complex part, but it's part of it. And just as we have problems with the physical side of our natural environment, we also have problems in the cultural side of our natural environment. And thus we find that philosophy is and ought to be concerned with moral and political problems, adjusting our cultural environment as well as our physical one. But in general, I want to sum up this brief point by saying knowledge is ultimately a natural relation between an organism, a biological entity, and its environment. And it's one that's marked by fruitfulness, right? It's a relation that is life-enhancing for the organism. Now, for all of his naturalism, Dewey, like all pragmatists, is in fact an epistemological idealist. I want to clear up different senses of idealist. There's two senses. There's metaphysical idealism, that there exists some ideal realm outside of the realm in which we live, and it's really there, it's objective, and it's probably more real in the world we live in. That's metaphysical idealism. Then there's an epistemological idealism, and that argues that the objects of our knowledge are in fact constructed by our inquiry. Okay, that seems very abstract and difficult, but in many ways it's a very common sense kind of view. How so? Well, take the notion of direction, north, south, west, and east. No one believes, I think, that those are natural relations, that the universe comes broken into north, south, west, and east, and that there's a true one. Right? It's always relative to where you are. That's something we added to the world. But it's nonetheless an object of our knowledge. I mean, direction is important to us. So consider this then. We invented or added, or better yet, we made as object of knowledge direction, and we've retained it because it's a useful tool in getting around our environment and working our way through a cityscape, for example, or a countryside. Now, a general way of putting this would be to say that what's true of direction is true of all of our schemes of the world. The world does not come pre-parsed into pre-packaged natural kinds. Our actual experience, our immediate experience, is like an animal's experience. It's precognitive. There are no concepts and no entities. There's just one damn thing after another. What intelligence, what thought does is it breaks things down, it chunks them into definable objects. It says this collection of particular molecules and substances and organs that seems to be changing over time is in fact one substance, a particular person. Or that this collection of colors and textures is one object, a podium. Right? That's a particular parsing. We parse it that way because we have certain functions towards this entity. If our functions change, our parsings change. Right? For me, I might look at this podium and say, this is, you know, a lectern for speaking, and it's made out of wood, or some ersatz wood. However, if I was a chemist, I might look at this entirely differently. I'd say, well, it's not really made of wood. It's made out of various chemical substances. It's made out of molecules. The physicist might reparse, say, well, it's not really the molecules. What it's really made out of is atoms, and maybe even subatomic particles. So what there is a function of what we're doing. And we create these ises, these entities of the world, as tools to help us adjust to our environment. We change them when they become more or less fruitful. As we develop better tools, atoms, molecules, we dispense with other tools, substances, or we keep them for restricted uses. So I want to say that not only our parsings and our objects of knowledge are instruments for action, but all of our theories are too, right? We develop theories of the world because they help us in, quote, understanding the world to manipulate it and change it. Now, Dewey's epistemological naturalism dramatically changed, I think, the traditional situation. First of all, the bane of traditional epistemology, which is skepticism, is finally eliminated. Why? Well, remember, from the spectatorial view of things, the contemplative situation, you can never be sure if the ideas in the subject's mind exactly correspond or copy the nature of things in the object world, because they're always mediated through his representations, through his ideas, right? And that's why Descartes opened up the possibility of skepticism. Well, naturalistic empiricism banishes that skepticism precisely because it eliminates the correspondence theory of truth, right? Our sentences or our beliefs aren't true when they copy the world. They're true when they work. What would it mean to say that a sentence is a copy of a thing or of a state of affairs? They don't look the same. States of affairs don't sound like the sentences which talk about them. Instead, sentences are tools. They're instruments. And there is no copying involved. Does the thing work? Is there a better sentence that better describes things so we can do better work? If this is the best sentence we have about something that fulfills our purposes, that's the true one. Okay. So the next element, the next change is that, in fact, for Dewey, we're best off forgetting the whole idea of truth. Right? If truth is always going to be associated with some eternal, unchanging verity, well, we never know what that is. So let's talk about warranted assertability instead. Let's say that a sentence or a theory has a warranted assertability when it works better than its competitors, when it solves the problems for which it was created. And that's, in fact, fits with our scientific legacy. Scientific theories are always susceptible to change, to emendation, and to replacement if one comes along that's better. And how do we know if one is better? It's practical results. It works better. It helps us explain things that the other couldn't. It helps us predict our experience in ways the other couldn't. I want to quote from Dewey on this point, because although he doesn't offer a theory of truth, the compliment he pays towards truth, its practicality, I think, is emblematic of what he's after. Now, an idea or conception is a claim or injunction or plan to act in a certain way as the way to arrive at the clearing up of a specific situation. When the claim or pretension or plan is acted upon, it guides us, truly or falsely. It leads us to our end or away from it. Its active dynamic function is the all-important thing about it. And in the quality of activity induced by it lies all its truth and falsity, not in a copy relation to the world. The hypothesis that works is the true one. And truth is an abstract noun applied to the collection of cases, actual, foreseen, and desired, that receive confirmation in their works and consequences. So again, contrary to traditional philosophy, there are no eternal truths and immutable truths. Even, for Dewey, the truths of mathematics and logic are instrumental. Now, these have served for us for a long time with great effect. But that's basically what they are. They're tools we developed very early on and they've worked very well. But it is not inconceivable that we could develop better logics, better mathematics, and then dispense with the old tools and adopt new ones. In fact, that's happened. We used to believe in a syllogistic Aristotelian logic, held for close to 2,000 years. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, we developed formal mathematical logic. We had no reservation among logicians to say, well, what we used to think was the truth of logic has been replaced by a new truth of logic. Similarly, in mathematics, we used to exclusively believe in the axioms of Euclidean geometry. We now believe in curved space. We've adopted different geometries. That could change again. Dewey always wants to argue that's always open. The project is never closed. So the point of knowledge is work, is practice. Knowledge then, and this is the key thing, is not something sui generis. It's not something unique that's not part of nature. It's in fact a natural phenomenon. It's a natural relationship between a complex organism and its environment. Now, I want to turn to the implications of Dewey's naturalistic empiricism on moral and political philosophy, because I think that's largely what motivated Dewey. He was very concerned with those issues. Dewey rejects the traditional quest of philosophy for ultimate ends, for that one true value that is the essence of all values and that all other values can be reduced to. And we have various candidates for that. There is Kantian duty. All morals ultimately turn out to be duty. You must do everything for the sake of duty. Or utilitarian pleasure and happiness. Everything must be a species of pleasure and happiness and conduce to it. Even benevolence and duty and charity all turn out ultimately to be pleasure and happiness. Dewey thinks that whole quest is part of that metaphysical traditional project. We'd be best off dropping it and applying that same experimental method we use in science to ethical problems to try and resolve some sort of good natural results. And this is important because for him ethical problems are just as natural as scientific problems. Okay. Well, for Dewey, humans, like all animals, are creatures of habit and disposition. Right? We have trained behaviors and propensities. And that's on one hand. On the other, we also have impulse. Impulse is that the spontaneous element in any organism and in nature, and it breaks through habits. It's what induces change. Now, what that means is, if we think about things like customs, mores, and institutions, what they really are widespread uniformities of habit. The custom of handshaking arises because a vast number of individuals share the habit of shaking hands upon meeting other people, and they do so because they've always found it a useful way of greeting one another. Okay. Now, the problem is, customs and habits become powerful because of their utility, their usefulness, the way they work. However, as the cultural and physical environment changes, they can sometimes outlive their usefulness. When this happens, a tension emerges between the environment, or part of the environment, and another part of the environment. The changed circumstances and the old customs and mores and institutions. Now, as this tension becomes acute, impulse is going to break through. If it doesn't, you're just going to get a fossilized culture. You're going to get something like, the New Kingdom of Egypt, which is just a fossilized 2,000-year-old variant of something that's far older, without any change. If that doesn't happen, impulse is just going to wildly break through the cake of custom, and things will fall apart. What you will get is, well, in the political realm, the most famous examples are violent political revolutions, where you get reigns of terror and destruction because the customs are just no longer fit into the modern world. French Revolution, excellent example, right? We are living in a more commercial, bourgeois, democratic world. The old feudal order, the customs and institutions of it no longer fit with that world. There's no accommodation. Therefore, kaboom, we head off to the guillotine. The function of intelligence or ethical philosophy should be to guide impulse instead of simply breaking institutions, in forming new ones, in forming new habits, in forming new customs. And again, to use the analogy, the function of philosophy should be to avoid revolutions by political reform. That's what ethical philosophy ought to do. It ought guide intelligent action in pursuit of an end. Now, I want to speak about ends. While ethics guide action in pursuit of an end, ethics does not itself determine that end. It doesn't tell us what we should pursue. This is another way of saying there are no fixed and final moral ends. Now that, to traditional philosophers, seems to be nihilistic. But it's actually not. It's actually, if anything, democratic. Fact of the matter is, our ends arise from our culture. We value the things we do because of the ways we've been brought up, because of the customs we've been raised with, because of the habits that we've been inculcated with by our parents and our schools and our society as a whole. And these ends change over time. At some point we may value salvation, 700 years ago. More recently, perhaps happiness or pleasure, prosperity, wealth, justice, and that varies with the culture. It's not so much that there are no values, which would be a truly nihilistic position. Rather, Dewey's an ethical pluralist in the sense that there's a multiplicity of values. Sure, justice is good, so's salvation, so's health, so's wealth, so's pleasure. There's a whole host of values, and in fact, everybody knows them. They don't arise from philosophy, they arise from life. And the ethical philosopher has no more insight to them than the plumber. Right? And it's an arrogant, hubristic claim on his part that he knows what the true ends are, and somehow the plumber doesn't. So what the philosopher needs to do, instead of trying to reduce all values to one ultimate value, or lexically order them, the philosopher should look at individual problems in a society. Each one is unique. There is no one fixed final solution. What do people want to do in that problem? What's the problem? Think his way through to a practical solution by saying, if we pursue this value in this situation, this is what we're going to get. And this is how we might do it. And then turn to the rest of his society and say, does this sound good to you? Or did you have some other end in mind? If you have some other end in mind, I'll show you how we might get there. And again, in that sense, it's profoundly democratic. So, ethics is not a deductive science or an a priori search for first principles. But it's really a practical science. It's very similar to Aristotle's notion of phronesis. Now, while values and ends, according to Dewey, are historically contingent, they're historicist, they're a function of our culture, as a creature of early 20th century America, Dewey has his own historically contingent ends, which I would describe as progressive and democratic. They're progressive because, like Nietzsche, he's an optimist who has an almost Promethean faith in change and growth. He also shares with Nietzsche the view that the individual character, or what is sometimes called human nature, is primarily the moral and social object of growth. Right? That's what we're interested in, human character, human nature. A person's character is constituted by their dispositions or habits. We are the sort of person we are because of the things we do, habitually and regularly, and that's how we know each other. This human nature isn't fixed or given. It's determined by our culture and customs. The goal of ethical philosophy, then, should be to change those customs and institutions to promote the development of this character, to develop its rich possibilities in as large an extent as possible. So thus, in a sense, like Nietzsche, Dewey's moral project is really one of self-creation. Right? Selves, personalities don't come fully formed, born into the world. They have to be created through institution, custom, training, and education. And that's one of the projects of ethical philosophy. That's why he's so concerned in pedagogy and making it a lifelong project, is to create selves. Dynamic, strong, vital selves. Selves which have no final ends, which are constantly growing and changing. Unlike Nietzsche, however, Dewey is democratic. He's interested in not only the self-creation of a handful of superior men, but in the self-creation of every single member of society. He thinks that in each of them there is a kernel, a possibility of development of a richly integrated character. In part, this is because the individual, for him, is always formed by his society and his culture. As such, if we want rich individuals, we need to change cultural institutions. So the ultimate test of any custom or institution is how it contributes to the growth of all the persons in that society. And this Promethean democracy is, I would argue, reminiscent of another ex-Hegelian naturalist, Karl Marx, whose communist man has a fully developed and rounded humanist character. He's the guy who is a shepherd in the morning and a literary critic in the afternoon. I think that's sort of what Dewey wants. All right, I want to sort of sum up now. Dewey's pragmatism, and pragmatism in general, in fact, is a combination of, on the one hand, particularly American attitudes towards democracy, work, progress, practicality, and science, things which Europeans see as thoroughly American and sometimes boorish. And on the other hand, a set of philosophical dispositions that constitute a dissenting theme within the modern philosophic tradition. It's the American variant, then, of a counter voice within the canon of traditional philosophy that speaks out against the given dualisms of subject and object, mind and matter, reason and experience, and, I would argue most importantly, theory and practice. This counter-canon would include people like Bacon, Marx, and Nietzsche, at the least, all of whom shared a deep and abiding naturalism, a view that talking about metaphysical realms is pointless. This is the world in which we live. As well as a view that somehow or other knowledge should be practical, that philosophy should have some impact on life and on society, and that it should further practical human ends, and that in this sense, traditional philosophy has been a miserable failure. Now with Bacon, Dewey shared a deep and abiding commitment to science and scientific method, and a deep and distrust of the blind adherence to the various idols of custom and convention. With Marx, he shared a commitment to social reconstruction, and in fact he was a socialist, although never a revolutionary, and a belief in social science and social democracy. But finally with Nietzsche, he shared a commitment to self-creation and dynamism, aesthetic and spiritual, as well as social and political.